Okay, well, I'd like to go ahead and get started. We're pretty close to 5 after the hour, and I can't really wait to hear our speaker begin. So I'll just start by welcoming everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you for coming. I always look forward to our gatherings where we can learn something new about a topic of such great importance to all of us. I'm Susanna Wu-Pong-Calvert, and I'm here representing both the Richmond Ions Community Group as a board member and also as one of the founding members of the Sanctuary of Earth, both of which are sponsoring this spiritual practice series. The series is designed to help us bridge the theoretical, empirical, and philosophical with people's lived experiences on topics of spirituality and consciousness. And to offer a range of options to promote individualization of our unique interface with the divine. It's the perfect partnership with the Richmond Ions Community Group, which focuses on the science of spirituality, and this series provides a complementary counterpoint by focusing on practice. And as you may know, we're meeting by Zoom on the first Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Like the Richmond Ions, we also rely on donations to operate, so we'd very much appreciate a donation of any amount, but hopefully a minimum of $10 to help us offer these programs and even grow. And the URL is on the slide. Just a brief word about the mission of the Sanctuary of Earth. We are here to actualize the human spiritual potential on Earth and for Earth by providing the bridge between the cognitive and empirical to the lived, embodied, grounded, and practical. We will eventually be creating a beautiful interactive online skill development modules for spiritual practice and the science of spirituality in divine timing. So this is where we get to live our spiritual practice by being patient. Tina's going to be introducing our speaker, but I wanted to just say a word about how I know Dr. Efthimiou, Olivia. She was introduced to me by a colleague here in Richmond, a retired professor from University of Richmond named Scott Ellison, who's a scholar on heroes. And I had been dying to meet Scott for some time, and I finally got a chance to do it. And he said, "Oh, you must meet Olivia." And we were instantaneously friends. And she has just such a beautiful perspective and practice. And she is just such a sweet and brilliant person and soul. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Tina, who will introduce Olivia, and Olivia will do an opening meditation. Welcome, Olivia.
Thank you. Sorry, it took me a moment to remember to unmute myself. So yes, we are so excited for this talk. Thanks everyone for being here, and Dr. Efthimiou, especially with an odd time. We really appreciate you being here. And just to let everybody else know, Dr. Olivia is a certified meditation teacher. She's a creative therapist, a spiritual and holistic counselor. Depression, our tonight's topic, is one of her specialties, but she's also a seated yoga teacher and a yoga life coach. She is widely published and also an accomplished researcher and scholar in fields like well-being, creativity, transpersonal and positive psychology, and integrative thinking. And that is where she received, or the field in which she received her doctorate in 2017. She's also an educator, a poet, a visual artist, an intuitive, and a spiritual activist. So she edited a volume, Heroism and Wellbeing in the 21st Century, Applied and Emerging Perspectives, in 2019. And this text is the definitive work on positive psychology and where it intersects with strengths-based approaches to well-being. So tonight I'm excited to hear a conversation between Dr. Efthimiou and our own Dr. Calvert. They will just kind of be teaching us and learning alongside us as well. At any time, feel free feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat, but I will save all of those for the end of our presentation, where there will be a time for questions, and you can also verbally ask questions at that time. So we are going to also have some opportunities to practice with Dr. Olivia tonight, and I will pass it over to her to go ahead and start one of those moments now.
Thank you so much, Tina and Susanna. It really is such an honor to be amongst you beautiful women, and everything that you're doing with Foundation, and of course our beautiful people have joined us from all around the world. It's, you know, the wonders of technology that we can commune like this in this space in what a lot of people say is the age of Aquarius, which, you know, of course combines science and spirituality, and technology and spirituality, which I think is going to be a really fantastic space to keep an eye on in the coming decades and centuries, depending if you believe in past lives or not, future lives. So I, for one, would probably want to reincarnate to see that union of technology and spirituality, which I think is our destiny. But yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's very humbling and it's an honor to be here. So yeah, heartfelt thanks. And I hope everybody gets something really practical and useful out of this today. I know some of us here have been on this spiritual journey pretty much all our lives. Some of us might be new to the spiritual journey, or maybe more consciously awakened to it. And some of us might sort of be hearing about it for the first time. So I'll try to sort of cater for all the different you know, stages of our growth and evolution, and hopefully there is something for everybody today. So I'll just start sharing my screen, and hopefully everything will go smoothly. So please, technology boards, shine very lovingly on us today. I will maybe start a slideshow, see how that goes. I'll wait for that to load. And yeah, great. So thank you once again for the pleasure to be here and present about the topic that is very, very near and dear to my heart, which is existential depression and spiritual awakening. The two really do go hand in hand, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully provide maybe some fresh insights for people who have been on this journey for quite a while, because it's important to keep making those connections and receiving that education. But first, I'd love to guide us through a very gentle, quick meditation, which is wonderful meditation developed by one of my teachers, Victoria Hawkins. And I'll talk a little bit more about her in the end. So this is just a really lovely little meditation called Out to In, just to help, again, on the theme of embodiment, to help center us, bring us into this space, and to, yeah, lovingly share all the knowledge that we will partake in. So just get comfortable in your seat, or on the floor if you are listening to us. Absolutely, feel free to lie down and just relax. I'm going to sound my singing bowl very gently, so just beware if you're wearing headphones. You might hear a bit of a ting. Just start to gently close your eyes, or just relax your eyes, soften your gaze, whatever you feel comfortable with. Just make sure, a bit of a posture check, make sure that your spine is straight, which of course is really important for our kundalini and our alignment in general and our energetic centers, and that we're not squashing our beautiful diaphragm that travels oxygen through our body. Just start to notice and observe anything you hear with your ears. And we'll travel through the senses throughout our body. Start to observe now anything that you smell with your nose in the space that you're in. And now start to notice anything that you taste in your mouth. Now observe anything that you might just start see with your eyes. And if your eyes are closed, start to pay attention to the shifting of the light space around you. Any particles that you see moving in the darkness with your eyes closed. Remembering that that is where your third vision is as well. As we slowly start to move our attention to the internal space, start to notice the physical sensations in your body. Notice how it feels to be seated on your chair, on your couch, or lying down on the floor. The texture of your seat and the ground underneath you. Now start to shift your focus on your thoughts and any emotions or feelings that are coming up. Remember that all thoughts and feelings are valid and relevant. And just allow them to float by like clouds in the sky. Now start to move your focus to your breath. Pay attention to the rise and fall of your chest. And notice how it feels as the air moves in and out of your nose. Maybe even out of your mouth if you're exhaling through that and breathing in through the nose. And continue to relax the mind as far as possible. Affirm that everything you feel, see, smell, taste, think is okay. As we slowly get ready to come back to our physical space and sharing the knowledge today, just continue to be the observer. of everything around you. You can slowly start to open your eyes. Thank you all for partaking in that. Okay, so today I'm just going to cover some key topics around spiritual awakening particularly. So I'm going to start off with what is a spiritual awakening and what is its purpose. And again, some of this might be information that you've heard of before, a good refresher. And some of you might be hearing this for the first time who are just starting on your journey. If so, very warm welcome to the crowd, to the tribe. I'm going to talk quickly about the stages of spiritual awakening, the way that I have collated based on the research that I've done. And then I'm going to go into talking about existential depression and its link with a spiritual awakening, what we commonly talk about as being the dark night of the soul. And then finally, I'm going to finish off with talking about why spiritual awakening is really particularly important at this time, our role, every one of us in this process for the planet, and then we're going to have a very experiential activity around navigating our spiritual awakening and framing that around embodiment, which is, of course, the underpinning philosophy of the foundation and the sanctuary of Earth. Okay, so what is spiritual awakening? First, I think it's really important to talk about words, and I love the etymology and the origins of words. I think it's really important. We tend to forget all words have come from somewhere, and most of them actually come from the Indo-European area, so the Sanskrit, very first language, and of course before that all the sort of pictorial and hieroglyphic origins of language. But the word spirit, according to the online etymology dictionary, has its roots in the mid-13th century. So it's got Anglo-French origins and also talks about 12th century, potentially modern French, from esprit. And I love how the origins it attributes to is really the breath. And we know that from the yogic tradition, all the ancient Eastern spiritual traditions, we talk about prana, we talk about chi in the Eastern traditions. So how the life force really travels on our breath. And it's probably no coincidence that the etymology of the word spirit is talking about the breath of life. So all the life force of God, of the universe, of the cosmos, whatever word you want to use for that higher power that travels through our breath and essentially animates us and inspires us in spirit. Again, the word inspiration has a close connection to that. So I think that's a really beautiful way to open this conversation. And another key note here, we don't really talk about this enough, and I think in the spiritual community, and it really goes back to being really compassionate and accepting of everyone. So part of the problem with spirituality having a bit of a taboo still is that in the scientific era that we have been living in for many centuries now, since the advent of scientism in the Enlightenment period and the Renaissance, where science really sort of came up and sidelined religion and particularly Christianity, a lot of us who don't know these sorts of intellectual traditions don't have an understanding that really spirituality and religion do complement each other, but they're not one and the same. So spirituality really is about, irrespective of what traditions and practices you delve into and choose to practice, any gods or deities or any particular doctrines that you ascribe to, it really, the essence of it is how do you find meaning, what makes you feel connected, and how should you live your life with purpose and inspiration, really. And so that is the core foundation of spirituality and being a spiritual person. So a person can be religious whilst being spiritual, and a spiritual person can be religious as well, but the two don't have to coexist with each other. So what is a spiritual awakening? There are quite a number of definitions, and of course, everyone from an experiential perspective based on their life experience. And also different academic traditions have different definitions. But I think this one is quite a recent one as well, by Cornell and Luke in one of the premier journals of psychology, so Frontiers in Psychology, which is an open source journal as well. And this article is free to download. They talk about defining spiritual awakening as a subjective experience in which an individual's ego transcends their ordinary finite sense of self to encompass a wider infinite sense of truth or reality. So again, moving from that finite and that temporal to that infinite space that transcends everything, transcends who we think we are, our perception of who and what we are in the world around us, and now going into the sort of higher realms of existence. And of course, when we talk about spirituality and spiritual awakening, it's synonymous with the term enlightenment. And of course, there have been many wonderful teachers that we have heard of growing up. There have been so many of them. I'm only going to name maybe a couple today, as for example, the Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama, as he was known back in his lifetime. And of course, the Buddha, as he was later known, achieving that title of the Enlightened One, was led from the pain of suffering and rebirth towards the path of enlightenment. And really the term Buddha means the awakened one. And of course, since that mantle has passed on to many other Buddhas in the Eastern tradition. And in the modern day world, many of us know of Eckhart Tolle, and he is another modern day Buddha and spiritual sage. Many people don't know the journey of Eckhart Tolle. We see him as this beautiful spiritual teacher who seems so grounded, so centered, and just has so much life-giving energy. But we don't sort of stop to talk about his story. And one night in 1977, Eckhart talks about that night that really changed his entire life. At the age of only really 29, so still very young, and after many long periods of depression, him suffering himself, he experienced a profound inner transformation where he talks about how he couldn't live with himself any longer. And that profound question of, well, what is the self? He felt drawn and catapulted into a void. And then that awakened a profound peace and a profound sense of being, of just observing and watching, that then gravitated to his entire next chapter of his life. And he has since passed on to many, many others and transformed the lives of many others in turn in the world. So what is the purpose of a spiritual awakening? I love this quote and the teachings of Dr. Lissa Rankin, and apologies for misspelling there. Her name is spelled Lissa. So Lissa Rankin is a wonderful doctor, a trained doctor based in the United States. And Lissa Rankin talks about finding your inner pilot light. So Dr. Lissa has had her own profound spiritual awakening through her own sense of despair, and has since gone on to really teach people in the medical profession and common folk like us on how we can really heal ourselves and not rely on the medical profession and medical institutions, and understand that really that healing light comes from within us, and it's all about tapping into that. So she talks about that inner healing light, referring to it as an inner pilot light. And she refers to it as that ever radiant, always sparkly, 100% authentic, totally effervescent spark that lies at the core of you. Call it your essential self, your divine spark, your Christ consciousness, your Buddha nature, your higher self, your soul, your wise self, your intuition, or your inner healer. The minute sperm met egg, this part of you ignited, and it's been glowing away ever since. I also love this quote by the wonderful Althea Luna, who's a spiritual counselor, and I highly recommend you check out her website with her partner and twin flame, Mateo Soul, in linawolf.com. Althea says that when we undergo a spiritual awakening, also known as spiritual ascension, we literally wake up to life. We begin to question our old beliefs, our habits, and our social conditioning, and see that there is much more to life than we could ever have thought possible.
So Olivia, this is like so interesting, like the purpose of a spiritual awakening. And I'm not sure I've ever really thought about it, but I had a question that arose as you were talking, that you said that if the purpose of our spiritual awakening is for us to find our inner pilot light, shouldn't we all eventually find it? Like, if that's the purpose of a spiritual awakening, shouldn't that also be the purpose of our human existence? And so why do some people awaken and others do not? And I know there's sometimes a precipitating event, but we can have lots of precipitating events and not awaken. Do you,
Absolutely.
is that something you'd like to reflect on?
Absolutely. That is such a fantastic and a huge, huge question. We could do a whole other
Okay, we'll have to have you back.
Right. So from my perspective, from everything that I've learned, and certainly this is the perspective that I hold, to really answer that question, it's probably, first of all, there's the readiness of the soul, of even the personality to awaken. So the personality in this lifetime, but also the vantage point of the soul. So when we start talking about spirituality, we start to now go into the realm of really the soul has the spectrum and the vantage point of infinity. So time and space, from that perspective, that higher vantage point of the cosmos, really doesn't exist. Time and space only exists in for us, that we have created those, the calendar, the day-to-day, the numbers, all that, those things that allow us to measure time, to measure our own personal journeys in the context of time, is a human construct, and it's a construct really of human civilization. Once we talk about human growth and really spiritual growth and evolution, we have to really think about in terms of the high vantage point of evolution, spanning many, many different cycles and actually many, many different lifetimes. So think about it as being, again, the hero. We're all on a grand hero's journey, and we're all going on an adventure in every lifetime, but not just every lifetime. We're all on a particular journey through cycles of journeys every single step of the way, from birth to maybe our teenage years. And so from childhood to our teenage years is another cycle that we usually go through, from the teenage years to the adult years, and then midlife, and then to elderly years and preparing for death. And likewise, through a span of lifetimes, we go through this cycle many, many different times. And from the vantage point of the soul, really, the spiritual traditions talk about the readiness of the soul to evolve and to awaken. As you would prepare a contract, in this day and age, we all engage in contracts throughout our lives, whether we're buying a home or we're starting a job, or even just simple contracts through marriage, through relationships we have with other people. There's always some sort of contract involved, and there's always choice involved. So the way that I have certainly come to understand it is that we make a choice from that higher vantage point whether we're ready to awaken to the truth. So when we come into the lifetime, we start fresh. When sperm met egg, as Lisa Rankin puts it, we pop out of the womb, we start, it's a clean slate, we start fresh. And a lot of spiritual traditions talk about how essentially our memory has been wiped, much like the wonderful science fiction movie The Matrix, which we won't go in here, but a lot of people talk about that. How we literally don't remember. We've actually agreed to that. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for not agreeing to remembering our soul's past, our soul's history, and also things like trauma as well. Stunt our growth. We know that trauma actually stops our memory from being fresh, and it also distorts our memory as well. So trauma plays a huge role in that. And so the soul and the personality as well in this lifetime, the soul from the perspective of many different lifetimes is made a contract, allows you due to trauma to not remember things. So there comes a point, I think, where we all make a conscious choice to really go, well, I'm going to make a new contract, or I'm going to consciously remember I'm actually going to take the next step of my journey. And it all depends if we're ready or not. And some of us just aren't ready, and that just has to be okay. Some of us are just not ready to confront the shadow and the trauma. And, you know, the excavation process I'll talk about in a second that really goes through with awakening. And again, you really have to be ready for that. And from the perspective of the soul or God or the universe, there's just full love and compassion for that process, that infinite process. You know, there isn't a timeline for it. You go at your own pace and your own timeline, and it's always done with loving compassion. So we all get there. We all get there eventually. It is our destiny. It is our birthright, but we all get there in our own time, and that has to be respected in the infinite process of the universe and our personal evolution. I hope that answers that a little bit. It's quite a complex question, but
Thank you.
so I want to expand on this a little bit more and talk about Carl Jung, who is really we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Carl Jung. So I've got to pay homage to these giants that came before us. So Carl Jung, for those of us who have been in transpersonal psychology and the positive psychology circles, even mainstream psychology as well, was an infamous, wonderful psychiatrist and psychoanalyst from Switzerland. He was born in 1875 and he passed away in 1961. So just at the cusp of the brilliant 1960s revolution. Actually, he really inspired the 1960s revolution as well. So let's remember that too and pay homage to that. So Carl Jung talked a lot about this spiritual based and holistic branches of psychology and psychological practice. And he really is the forerunner of the schools of thought and the branches of psychology like transpersonal psychology and paranormal psychology, as well as the wonderful field of creative arts therapy. So he was really a giant. He was responsible for inspiring this, as well as the brilliant Joseph Campbell, who talked about the hero's journey. And also, a fun fact, Carl Jung had a near-death experience that maybe talk about, so that would have certainly informed his perspective on death and life, and also spirituality and intersection with living your best life. So when we look at Carl Jung's work, that is really the key clues around the process of spiritual awakening, which is really a process of excavating the layers of our consciousness. I always like to talk about it, how we are the archaeologists of our soul through this process. So if we think about this iceberg of consciousness, these layers of consciousness, where we start off at the top from the ego, which I'll talk a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about as well in a second. So the ego is really our conscious self. It's our thoughts, our feelings, and emotions that we are aware of, that we are awakened to. And it's really the mask that we show to the world. It's our personality. So things like Myers-Briggs personality constructs, you know, personality quiz tests, the world that you show to your work colleagues, the world that perhaps, the face that I'm perhaps showing to you now, it's our exterior masks that we put on to survive and to navigate this world around us, the physical space around us. But that's not all that we are. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't understand that there are so many hidden layers to us that we don't see. So part of the spiritual awakening process to start excavating deeper. So the next level of consciousness that we excavate is what we call, what Carl Jung talked about as being the personal unconscious. So this is where a lot of the trauma starts coming to play. So a lot of the repressed memories, a lot of people have been through trauma talk about having repressed memories and also distorted memories of events that happened to them, particularly around the formative years between 0 and 5. So those are the things that we have temporarily forgotten. So every piece of information, even we now know from science that from the womb, we actually start to ingest and absorb information while we are in our mother's womb. So that process starts very, very, very early on, from the moment that sperm met egg, and that conception process happened is really the first moment of the breath of life, of inspiration, of actually spirituality entering our consciousness. And many spiritual traditions talk about how, particularly the Eastern ones, how our soul chose our physical body inside the womb when we entered it. So that's the first sort of layer where we start to excavate when we go through the spiritual awakening process. And then we have the deeper, much deeper layers that are quite challenging to tap into, but are absolutely possible, which we call the collective unconscious. Now, this is the very shared memories and that we have as a human species, and actually probably beyond that as well, beyond the human species. But again, that's a conversation for another time. So those are the sorts of universal patterns, the images, sound, so a lot of the pre-language centers of the brain that are very primal and pre-human. So we start to talk about, from an archaeological perspective, our evolution, starting from pre-Homo sapiens to all those different incarnations that we've had, including our animal incarnations as well, and what Carl Jung talked about as being the archetypal nature of human behavior, and again, pre-human behavior. This is another diagram that I saw scrolling through my Instagram feed, which I do try and keep quite controlled. But I love this wonderful post from Persephone's sister, who is a Jungian Wicca, which is a branch of Wicca and witchcraft and paganism. So she is a Jungian Wicca, and she uses Jungian psychology to express and understand the different spiritual tools that we can use. And she posted this photo of another diagram by Yolande Jacobi. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. And I love how Yolande actually talks about a fifth layer of consciousness, so, or unconsciousness. So if you look at the very, very bottom layer, number 5 on the screen there, that is the one below even the collective unconscious, where she talks about, Yolande talks about the part of the collective unconscious that can never be made conscious. So I really do ascribe to that thought, because being in the human body and in the technology and the tools that we have, the senses that we have available to us, we can only access certain parts of cosmic consciousness. And there are highly likely, and I'll put my money on that, certain parts that will never be made available to us, purely and utterly because of the fact that we inhabit this physical vessel that we're in now. So those parts of us will probably never be made known to us until we shed this mortal coil and return back to source origin upon our death. And of course, a lot of the scholastic and the spiritual literature talks about how a lot of people tap into this ineffable or unknowable state whilst having having had near-death experiences and having been brought back, where they talk about particular common patterns that there are, that we know that exist for people who have died and come back. And so there is a stage reportedly between this life and in between preparatory phase, if you will, upon then the soul choosing to incarnate into its next physical vessel and to its next stage of incarnation and evolution of soul. So the next thing I want to talk about very quickly only is the stages of spiritual awakening, to really sort of contextualize what does depression have to do with all this. So there is no sort of consensus around the stages of spiritual awakening, but this is the stages that I have compiled based on research that I've done, both academically, by listening to other wonderful spiritual teachers and them talking about drawing on their lived experience, and also from my own lived experience through my spiritual awakening. So the first stage appears to be that there is a shock or a trigger that activates it. That this can be spontaneous, as for example, Eckhart Tolle's appears to have been, and doesn't need to have preceded a trauma. So some people seem to have spontaneously agreed where they might be sitting there in their living room one day and all of a sudden they feel a jolt of energy and their life is forever changed. However, most people are awakening. That shock or trigger is the trigger is a trauma. Now, this trauma is entirely subjective, so it can be something that for others might be entirely that would be easy for them to cope, and it might appear to be benign for someone else, but for that person, it's very, very profound. So it can be something like a job loss, the loss of a partner, relationship breakdown. It can be a move from home. It can be even something simple like watching a video, hearing a particular piece of information. So it's really a light that switches on in your body. The second stage that may or may not accompany so you can either be in denial, so you might deny what is happening to you, or you might readily accept it. I know for me, once that initial shock or trigger, I spent about a year in a phase of denial in terms of trying to go back to the way things were, living my life the way it always had been, until you reach a point where you realize that the old pathways will just never work and that you will actually have to accept that you will never be the same again. So depending on how long we're in denial for, that stage, our spiritual awakening can be extended and become much more painful than what it can be. The third stage is, I like to call it the honeymoon period. So once you have that initial acceptance of your journey, you start to have some wonderful insights that start to come through and downloads, spiritual downloads, as we like to call them, where you start to really sort of enrapture around. It's a very exciting, you're just starting out on your adventure. Everything is new and fresh, like when you first meet someone and you're in love and everything's, beautiful for the first time. And that can last again for a while. And for some people, it doesn't last that long. Then we have the next phase of the dark night of the soul, where really everything comes crashing down and you get a bit of a rude awakening. The dark night of the soul and the next phase, which is the hermit phase, where you go into a general forced isolation. And some people actually really physically remove themselves from society in order to really navigate this tumultuous space that they found themselves in, because physically being in society in the status quo is actually so incredibly painful for your energetic system. So those stages 4 and 5, from my experience and research, are quite the longest ones, and they can last for years. Then once you sort of start to navigate your journey and start to come out of that really tumultuous phase, comes the grounding phase. Again, this phase tends to also last for years, if not the rest of your life, where you really start to embody and ground in the lessons that you've learned. You really start to walk the walk. You start to show up in the world in a much more authentic version of yourself. And you start to really, again, use very ground and embodied based spiritual practices that we're going to talk a little bit about and actually practice today as well. And the final part of the spiritual awakening phase, which ties into the enlightenment, is that you really learn to embody your Buddha nature and really learn to live your life purpose and pass on all these learnings to other souls on the planet and then help others to awaken. So very much like the hero's journey, where you embark through all this, and then the return phase, the hero always gives back to the community in return to what has been given to them.
So, Olivia, are you saying that a person cannot fully embody their life purpose unless they have a spiritual awakening, or can it be done without a spiritual awakening if you go through enough cycles of the hero's journey?
Yeah, so that's another fantastic question, Susanna. So I should preface all this by saying, though, these stages, are not clear cut. So they're not, and they're also not linear. So many of us will actually skip all these stages, go straight to life purpose. We'll probably jump back and forth between stages. So you might actually end up living your life purpose for a little bit and go back to having a dark night of the soul. Some of us might stay in the grounding phase and never get to the life purpose. But I think part of this, having this more flexible view, is that you don't need to complete this cycle to be of value and to contribute to this world. It just probably means that by completing this entire cycle, whether in one lifetime or many lifetimes, you actually become more whole. It's really about showing up, being more of you. So think about this unfolding process of a rose, where you unfold more and more, and you just get more grander and more beautiful. Your light becomes brighter and brighter and brighter and more luminescent, more effervescent. You sparkle more, you show up more with more light in the world. Obviously, the more light that you show up in the world with, the more it will glow and be a beacon for other people. But even that small spark of light, even being a little bit more whole, a little bit more of you every step of the way, is so entirely and absolutely vital to both your personal evolution and to the evolution of the planet and to everyone around you. So in that short answer, yes, you don't have to completely embody this journey, complete this journey to have those different stages of awakening. So let's get into the sort of other part of our talk, which is the existential depression and spiritual awakening. I'm going to talk about this quote by another wonderful spiritual teacher, Adi Ashanti. If you haven't heard of him, really, really encourage you. He's such a beautiful soul to investigate him further. So Adi Ashanti talks about how the enlightenment is a destructive process by its nature. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seen through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagine to be true. And this quote really struck a chord with me when I was going through my dark night of the soul, and it helped to put a lot of things into context. Now, I love this sort of, I'm going to pose this question here. I'm going to say, well, we talk about the dark night of the soul. The Dark Night of the Soul was originally written about by another sage, the 16th century mystic Saint John of the Cross. So he talked about this and coined this term when he was going through his own period of darkness in search for God and his purpose. But I'm going to preface that and say, well, is it really the dark night of the soul? Because the soul always really knows, right? The soul has a high vantage point and actually knows everything. Everything you know is stored in your soul and your higher self. So maybe really we need to talk about it in terms of the dark night of the ego. Because really what's happening through this process is that you've got two parts of you. You've got the awakened self that knows and understands, and you've got the ego that is really, we have to drag it along and dragging its feet. Sometimes like a petulant child that's screaming, and you have to put it in its place. The ego is identified by Anne Hopwood, who is a Jung researcher and talks about how Jung saw the ego as it's the center of the field of consciousness, which contains only our conscious awareness and our personal identity. So it's that mask that we wear. And part of this is that we need to drop that mask. So part of the awakening process is, in order to really intimately excavate yourself and recover and discover your true purpose, is to experience the death of the ego. It's really a crumbling, it's an awakening to your shadow. And this is the four major archetypes that Jung talked about. And I'm just going to focus on the left part here, where we have the persona and we have the shadow. So the shadow is that animal side of our personality. Again, notice that's the source of our creative and our destructive energies. There is no way to create a new sense and a new journey, a new chapter, unless you actually destroy. So destruction is actually a very sacred process that many of us are afraid of. And part of this deep, deep fear is going to come online, and it's going to, for a lot of us, derail the spiritual awakening process. So it's really important to be aware that in order to come alive and to allow this process to go as smoothly as possible is to come in touch with both your creative and your destructive energies. So part of going through a depression is really for allowing these destructive energies, but allowing them to come online in a healthy way if you understand what your depression is trying to tell you. There are many different types of depression, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. But existential depression is only one type of depression. And it's a very unique type of depression, which again really goes hand in hand with spiritual awakening. And existential depression really ties back to what we talked about, what is spirituality. So it's very much caused by a lack of connection with our meaning. Who am I? What am I? And what is the purpose of my soul? There is a deep yearning that accompanies and really defines this type of existential depression, a deep void, if you will, that can never be filled, that is generally uncharacteristic of other types of depression, such as seasonal depression or hormonal depression or biological depression. According to the lovely Althea Luna, soul loss is really the root cause of existential depression or spiritual emergency, because once this existential depression becomes profound, it becomes what we term a spiritual emergency. According to Althea Luna, existential depression is caused by soul loss, and it's a bit of a vicious circle that we get trapped in, which is why the dark night of the soul and the hermit phase of spiritual awakening can actually last for many years, if not decades, and many of us can become lost in it. What I like to sort of call the valley of the lost souls. We get trapped and stuck in that, unfortunately.
Is there
So
any
this soul is
is there any data about the incidence of this? Like how prevalent is it? And is it increasing in prevalence or decreasing? Are there trends?
Yeah. So obviously research around this particular one, I would venture to say, has not been done, because research funding has to be allocated for for research to occur, and unfortunately the powers that be deem that research, a lot of the funding just goes to a lot of the mainstream causes of disease and technology and science and technology in particular. However, we can surmise and make some really interesting correlations around the fact that depression is running rampant, so that we have a lot of data and statistics that are clearly stating that medication is now going, the uptake of medication is going through the roof, through general practitioners, people seeking out psychiatrists, psychiatric support, counseling support, psychological support, and even complementary therapies now is now going through the roof. And of course, COVID, a lot of the spiritual circles are clearly saying that COVID has been the catalyst actually for spiritual awakenings around the world and the catalyst for spiritual emergencies. So even though this data evidence is not specifically using this language, we can absolutely make that connection. And through a lot of spiritual teachers and a lot of coaches who are doing this work, spiritual counselors who are working in this space, certainly anecdotally, their data and evidence would be that they are seeing a surge in their clients talking about these lived experiences, people talking more openly about these transrational experiences that people can't explain, that maybe in the past they would have been very closed about, that maybe thought about they might have been deemed crazy or insane or losing the plot, but they are now actually talking about these paranormal perhaps experiences they can't explain. So a lot of the evidence actually is there. It's about connecting the dots. So certainly a lot of interesting research to come forth in the next few years and decades, if not centuries. So soul loss is what causes the dark night of the soul, and in turn, unfortunately, the vicious cycle means that the dark night of the soul then keeps propelling existential depression. Again, it's a vicious cycle and it's dangerous. And so I mentioned the word dangerous. So it's actually dangerous because I talked about a little bit earlier on how it's actually our birthright. So we are all going to get there in the end. This is our birthright to spiritually awaken and to go through many different cycles that will awaken our Christ consciousness, our Buddha nature, and to fully become enlightened. But from a biological point of view and a psychological point of view, it's actually a biological and evolutionary imperative. Abraham Maslow, another wonderful giant in the psychology space and the transrational and transpersonal psychological space, as early as 1943, talked about in his theory of human motivation this concept of self-actualization that has been around for nearly a century. And if you'll see in this pyramid, many of us will know this pyramid. For those who don't know, this is such a foundational pyramid to know. So these are the pyramid of human needs that Abraham talked about. So he talked about how there are psychological needs and then there are more spiritual needs, so the higher order needs. And all these needs need to be consecutively met from the bottom up in order for us to continue on our evolution journey and to achieve the peak of our, the best that we can be in this world. So all our needs from physiological safety, love, and belonging need to be met first, which are the lower order needs, if you will, and leading up to esteem, which psychologists talk about deficiency needs. And in the top of the ladder, he had what we call self-actualization. So this is the spiritual drive to become enlightened. Unfortunately, in today's modern world, with science having cut off religion and the transcendental and the transrational, this top part of the pyramid has been cut off. And so what happens with that, with the absence of these wonderful rituals that were present in our tribal structures many centuries ago, is that we have cut off a limb. It is like we've forgotten a part of ourselves and we're functioning without a head, without an arm, without a leg. So how can you be your fullest self unless you are aware of this evolutionary imperative to self-actualize and not nurture it? And unfortunately, our systems, our modern systems, do not nurture and educate young people, the future of tomorrow, around this need for self-actualization. As Joseph Campbell, another giant in the space, who talked about the hero's journey, which closely ties into this process of self-actualization and enlightenment, Joseph Campbell talked about how we in the modern world are living in the age of anxiety. And he talks about how the failure of mythology and ritual to function effectively in our human civilization, in our Western civilization in particular, may account for the high incidence among us of the malaise that has led to this age of anxiety. So Joseph talked about this high incidence of malaise back in 1959 that has only gotten worse exponentially, particularly with COVID. So again, these giants were the prophets of our times, and it is sad that in a century still we have become worse and have not been listening to these spiritual traditions and scholastic traditions that have been around for centuries. And when I talk about for centuries, I literally mean for thousands of years. We talk about the Gospel of Thomas. So many different traditions have talked about this danger of not awakening to your true inner self. This is not a fanciful idea. It is actually a must. According to the Gospel of Thomas, and again, these are all rough translations, but this says how if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. But if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Again, this very intimate, dynamic dance between destruction and creation. Before we go into our experiential practice, I want to talk a little bit about why is awakening today so important for our planet and our future at this particular moment in human history. So this moment in human history is actually quite pivotal, and there is, again, a lot of different evidence, both scholastic and non-scholastic, but there is certainly evidence and a lot of anecdotal evidence as well from a lot of people working in the space that have talked about how there has been a turn. There is a pivotal point in human history that, according to some of the evidence, has been actually happening since around World War II. Let's not forget, of course, the 1960s, which was classified, generally speaking, historians have accepted that the post-World War II era has been a turning point from a number of different degrees of intellectual thought, of spiritual thought, and of scientific thought. So post-World War II, we enter what we call the postmodern era. So the way that we started seeing the world, the way we started creating, the way we started engaging with the world really, really shifted. And Dolores Cannon is one such prominent figure in the spiritual circles that has really written about this extensively. So Dolores is really interesting because she was a regressive hypnotherapist and a psychic researcher who started prolifically interviewing hundreds of people. Since sort of around that era, she has since passed on. And she always asked them some very set questions that, the way that I've seen it, were not leading in any way. Because we know that with hypnotherapy, there are some ethical issues around this, and there is the capacity to lead your subjects. Dolores, from what I've seen, did not lead her clients, her subjects. And again, hundreds of people were questioned and brought under a state of subconsciousness, again, delving onto that personal and collective unconscious, where a lot of our wisdom is excavated on earth. So Dolores asked all these subjects a range of very clear questions, very matter-of-fact questions, such as, why were you born? What is your purpose for being born at this time, and so forth. So she has identified 3 waves, and she identified that these souls, these people, started saying very, very similar things. They all started saying that they had specifically incarnated at this time since the 1940s in order to help the Earth in its ascension process, in order to help Earth as a collective awaken and for humanity to awaken. And Dolores identified through her research 3 progressive waves through having interviewed these subjects through these decades. The first wave was in the 1940s, and apparently, according to the subjects, they identified that the trigger for this in human planetary field and cosmic consciousness was the atomic bombs that went off in Hiroshima during World War II. We know from a planetary scale this was a monumental, disastrous, and dangerous period in human history. And so, according to these subjects, this had ripple effects and was felt throughout the time-space continuum. Remember that in the language of the universe, time and space are only human constructs. So these souls have specifically awakened to assist with this process, and they also have a very difficult time adjusting to our chaotic world. These souls were known to be particularly sensitive and have very particularly empathic qualities. And a lot of scholars in the astrology field have talked about how we have also entered potentially, or are entering, very quickly entering, a new phase in planetary cycle called the Age of Aquarius. There's a lot of disagreement in the calculation around this because astrology, as compared to astronomy, is not a precise science. But generally speaking, a lot of the scholars in this field talk about how we're probably going to enter into it in the 23rd or 24th century. So all this work is really to prepare and herald this new age on the planet. So starting from now. And a lot of this new age is going to really talk about marrying science and spirituality. So it's going to be a very integrated period in the history of the human planet, with science and spirituality having been split over the last few centuries, are now coming together to herald in a new stage of human evolution, human consciousness. So before we go into our practical practice that I want to finish off with today, very quickly talking about navigating spiritual awakening. And for me and for many of us in this space, really the key to navigating this challenging period in our lives is the body. So the body is the sacred tool that we have been gifted through which to access our divine nature, hands down. So it's not about something ethereal that exists in the higher realms, which it does, but it is as per the Hermetic principles, as within, so without, as above, so below. So it's about activating, using our cellular structure and our biological structure to align with our divine nature and to uncover the ultimate purpose of our personal and our collective hero's journey. Althea Luna talks about embodied spirituality, and we don't often define embodied spirituality. Embodied spirituality, according to Althea, is the lived experience of spirituality that is grounded in the body. When we embrace embodied spirituality, we come out of our minds and back into our bodies and our heart space, into that which is visceral and instinctual and deeply felt through all our senses. We see that the body isn't just a temple of the divine, but it's a living expression of spirit. As such, the body becomes a source of tremendous wisdom and insight and a doorway to the present moment. It becomes a microcosm of the macrocosm and a path to the transcendent and the immanent nature of the divine. Some of the things that I have discovered along this journey, which really ultimately is about learning to getting to know ourselves for the first time, learning to love ourselves for the first time, because that's the ultimate purpose of the universe is love, which is really unification and transcendence. Things like moving and being mindfully through those ancient spiritual traditions that are passed down to us, such as meditation, yoga, tai chi, and qigong, or even just simply moving and dancing our bodies to sound and rhythm, connecting and making decisions authentically, connecting with our creativity through many various mediums, such as drawing and painting, singing, sculpting. Plant medicine and plant teachers, another huge topic. When I say plants, I mean everything and all-encompassing. I mean plants that we ingest in our bodies simply from organic food, preferably, from diets, from vegetables to fruits, to anything that is grown from the earth, and also our wise plant medicine teachers, such as cannabis, such as psilocybin, ayahuasca, peyote, and many more. Self-love and compassion, stillness and slowness, committing to following our bliss and our inspiration, translating that into inspired action, and not being afraid to become the rebel of our story. So that's the end until we move into our spiritual practice. So if there's any questions, I'll take them out. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time probably.
No, thank you so much. That's great. And I think that we all enjoyed all the things that you brought. It's a lot of things to squeeze into an hour. I'll just bring our first question from the chat. Scott, I'll just summarize it. It's basically asking, how do we know when the difference between self-transcendence that is going in a healthy, positive direction, or a type of transcendence that maybe we associate with cultism or things that others of us have witnessed to be destructive?
That's another fantastic question. And I think it really comes down to this. It comes down to using our body as the guiding medium. Listening to our body. So when we talk about our inner pilot light, it really is our inner compass and our inner guidance system. So a lot of this spiritual process, when we talk about the dangers of this journey, a lot of these dangers align both with the danger of actually not fulfilling our purpose. And it's dangerous because it means that we, by virtue of not fulfilling and tapping into our purpose, we actually the whole planet of that and our collective evolution. But the other danger of this is a lot of the dangers of spiritual bypassing and not using our discernment. So unfortunately, when we are highly sensitive, and particularly when we're in the honeymoon phase of the bliss period of the spiritual awakening process, there are a lot of pitfalls in terms of falling into what we call, I guess, false teachers, people who can guide us down the wrong path. Having said that, I think it's really important to preface this back into the flexible approach of the higher vantage point of this is a journey, and everything that your soul has planned out, whether it appears to be wrong in the context of that moment, is actually from your soul's perspective, excuse me, really valuable. So understanding that everything that you learn, whether it does drag you down a seemingly wrong path or a destructive path, it actually serves a purpose. So remembering that both destruction and creation have to go hand in hand, and there is a dynamic dance. Being kind to yourself and probably understanding that always hindsight and 2020 vision is fantastic. But unfortunately, in that moment, we don't always have the benefit of hindsight. And that's part of the process of the human experience. We do not have that vantage point. We don't have a crystal ball, and we don't have the capacity to telepathically yet connect to our past and our future. We can tap into it. We can always ask our spirit for guidance. We can use these practices such as meditation, such as working with the body, such as actually asking questions, posing the question to spirit, to our higher self, working with art and music and dance, and seeking that inner guidance and saying, is this wrong for me? Is this right for me? Tapping into that wisdom, journaling and so forth. But in the end of the day, to be kind to ourselves, because even if we go down to what's a destructive path, actually it's all done part of our higher purpose and our higher learning, that this is what we simply needed to go through. So we always need to have that higher vantage point, that higher perspective in mind.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'll just share my own opinion that I gathered from you too, is when you were talking about Dolores Cannon, you used wording along the lines of like, she was inviting people and wasn't necessarily leading others.
Yes.
So that's something that I think our conscious minds can engage in to see when are folks offering us invitations from their life purpose, or when are they trying to lead with power over from their ego.
Absolutely, exactly. And you hit the nail on, Heather. It's about ego. So always asking that question, am I being driven by ego? Because remember, there's a tug and pull war going on throughout this process between the ego and the higher awakened self. So they're both present at the same time. It's just a matter of leaning into that higher self side, so the pendulum shifting to that side a little bit more, so that your ego can quieten a little bit rather than and take a bit of a backseat. And really that whole process about constantly working very gently, very lovingly with that ego, because the more we fight it and the more we drag it along, the more it's going to fight back and lead us down to those pathways, non-optimal pathways of, you know, perhaps that are not great for us in the moment, but ultimately are exactly what we needed in that moment.
Yeah, I'm laughing over here from my own experience of that. And Susanna has a great question. This is something I'm very curious about too. Do you personally have a sense of whether pharmaceuticals impede our ability to move through existential depression? And if there's any data that you know of, will you share that too, please?
Yeah, again, another brilliant question. So this is a very, very sensitive question. And have to preface this by the fact that I am of the school of thought of integration. And I think, remember that the spiritual awakening process and ultimately the ultimate goal is integration, as is really the goal of evolution of planetary and human consciousness. So when I talked about how the new age is about really marrying, it's not about discarding one side or the other. It's actually marrying science and spirituality. It's marrying all the modern, beautiful, wonderful modern tools that we have at our disposal that have been really hard fought with so many, discoveries from science that so many wonderful researchers have toiled over for centuries, not discarding that body of knowledge, but marrying that with those amazing, long-standing spiritual traditions that are perhaps more heart-centered and really integrating the two. So having said that caveat, for me, I believe that both can work together. I believe that, remember, the spiritual awakening process is both a biological process and it is also a psychological process, an emotional and a spiritual process. All selves must work in unison to create your optimal self and to allow you to unfold in your whole. And every cellular structure is going to be different. So some bodies, some biological makeups do not take well to the pharmaceuticals. And you will, I think, very quickly know this. You will very quickly understand that you are very sensitive to toxins, and not just pharmaceutical toxins, but toxins like any chemicals in your household, in the environment around you. And many people through the spiritual awakening process, actually their path to wholeness is to completely eliminate any and all toxins, to go completely organic. And again, that's what they find works for them. That's their way of achieving that balance and that high wisdom. For others, they really need to work both with the pharmaceutical knowledge. They don't seem to have a problem with toxins and the chemicalization, and they work well with that, complementing that with more natural therapies and perhaps plant medicine as well. So whilst they maybe wean themselves off gradually off the pharmaceuticals and returning to a more natural state. For others, they may well need to balance themselves. They need the support of pharmaceuticals because their biological system is so bombarded and constantly flooded. They simply are not ready, and they do not have, they may have the tools because the tools are always at our disposal, but they don't yet have that personal resilience yet built in, that they need many decades to build, and that they need that more intensive support from that jolt in the system, from that pharmaceuticals do actually give you in terms of rewiring your biological system, particularly around the cases of schizophrenia and things like that, and maybe bipolar disorder. So again, I think we have to take a very flexible and compassionate approach because, the research from mental health space shows it's a very complex thing, particularly from a genetic perspective. So I think I'll go back to that, listening to your body and using those body-centered practices to listen into what is right for you. And remembering that one thing that suits you in one moment may not suit you at all, even 3 months from now or 10 years from now. So listen to your body.
Yeah, I love too, you used the word earlier, discernment, and I'll just throw in there too that the wonderful experience of being human is we do kind of fluctuate between ego and spiritual. And so, some questions for us to ask around pharmaceuticals: is ego demonizing pharmaceuticals because we've heard from others that pharmaceuticals are bad? Or is ego praising pharmaceuticals just because a medical expert has told us to use them? And then by the same way, yeah, like what is our higher self asking us to do? Is it to use a tool that maybe we haven't tried before? Or is it to stop using something that potentially we're leaning on to numb ourselves? So
yeah, beautiful. And I think you answer your own question really wonderfully, Tina. I think it's you just answered a question answered at the same time. So I think that ego absolutely does all that because we live in an ego-based universe. So yes, and we know, look, in the spiritual circles, there are people who do demonize pharmaceuticals. And likewise, in the medical profession, there are those who demonize complementary therapies and suggest that they are not evidence-based and that there is still, heebie-jeebie, voodoo, whatever it is, Again, there is a wonderful sort of generation, and I think that's part of the purpose of the souls that have incarnated, the last century, that really advocate for both and take that very flexible approach that you know, it takes, and I'll go back to that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. You're not going to, you're never going to get anything from one person or expert, you know, or loved one. You know, everyone has something to teach you on a journey, whether it's, you know, an animal that you come across, every single being, or, you know, the most supposedly qualified person, you know, because even experts are on their own journey. They don't know everything. And we're always constantly learning. And that's actually part of the scientific process. So any scientist that tells you that they have the answers, or that they espouse something, they're actually probably saying it wrong, because any good scientist will tell you that science is only as good as its last best guess, you know, with all the rigorous instruments in place, which, you know, some instruments yet to be developed. So.
Yeah, well, perfect. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Lawrence so he can ask a question. And I think this will probably be our last question looking at the time. So go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Olivia. It's been something of great interest to us at Sanctuary of Earth to focus on not only our personal and transpersonal best interest, but the best interest of the planet that is our host. In other words, our dominion is not to take, but to support and to co-create with the earth. And so perhaps the earth's purpose is our purpose, ultimately. Does that make any sense to you?
100%. 100%. And I see Susanna put that wonderful up.
Thank you.
Was there a question associated with that, Lawrence, or was that just a
statement? Well, I was just wondering if you would like to just elaborate a little bit about it, if from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, another brilliant observation and question. For me, it goes back to, and I'm going to go back to that idea of the body. And I'm going to talk about, which some people who know me have heard me talk about before, about this idea of a holon. So when you look at the macro system and ecosystems theory and the idea of holokeys and holons. So a holon is something that is both a part as well as a whole at the same time. And if you look down to our very basic cellular structure, we know, scientifically speaking, that the cell actually has everything that it needs to propagate life. It has all the functions of the entire body built in within it, and is perfectly capable as an independent unit to function independently. However, the cell, with its other many communities of billions, I think it is cells, or trillions, I think it was billions, is working together to build a whole body. So when we look at the ecosystem model, we start from the atom and we build up from the cell, we build up to your arm, the different body part, the organs, and then we build up to the different systems, up to the whole physical body, and then we start going beyond. We start going into, well, you, Lawrence, you know, you as a human being are part of society, a part of your community and your neighborhood, are part of a family. Then you're part of society, then you're part of your nation and your country, and then you're part of the world. And I'm sure those can be broken down even further. So actually, the whole planet is a wonderful, huge body that we're all living, all these many different bodies coinciding together in unity, in harmony, balancing each other. And without that harmony, we all fall. So when one falls, the next person falls. So it really is a personal collective responsibility to awaken, to feel, to live your best life in your life's purpose. Because without it actually letting down the entire world and the entire universe, as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. That's why he said it, because he knew the truth of it. So yeah, completely espoused to that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Go ahead, Tina.
No, you go right ahead.
Well, I just wanted to thank Dr. Efthimiou for a really provocative talk and giving us so much nuance about the different stages of the spiritual awakening process, and that we're, even in this room, which I feel are people who are fairly committed to their spiritual development. We are all in different places on that spectrum, and it just helps to get so much perspective. So thank you. I also wanted to remind everybody here that we do rely on your donations to create and sustain these programs and the developing of new offerings going forward. So if you feel so moved to make a donation, we would appreciate it. The URL is sanctuaryoferarth.org/donate. And I just wanted to also announce what next month's speakers plural, are. Christy Gray is my own spiritual teacher. She's in Athens, Georgia. And Kim Long was my Reiki teacher. So we're going to be doing like a little 3-way discussion about spiritual practice in general, working with energy, light, and earth. A discussion with the wise women of Athens should similarly be illuminating and inspiring. And I hope you will join us. And if you are not on the mailing list, you can go to the Richmond, Central Virginia IONS community group and join the mailing list, and you will just get an email. You'll get 2 emails a month, one for Sanctuary of Earth and one for the IONS talk. So I think that wraps us up, and we are right at 8:30. And thank you for staying, for getting up early for us, Olivia. It's always just such a treat to spend time with you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, and hope to see you next month.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thank you.
again.
Okay,
Amazing.
Wonderful. Here. Wonderful.
we'll be in touch.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye now. Lovely.